Welcome to the fourth panel discussion for the 2021 Virtual Accra SDG Investment Fair. And this panel discussion is on the topic, the AfCFTA potential source of sustainable financing for SDGs on the continent. Thank you so much for joining us. We have two very interesting people to talk to on this panel. This panel is trying to draw a link between the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and the Sustainable Development Goals. And there appears to be a thin line between the two, because the purpose and objective of the AfCFTA essentially is to eradicate poverty through inclusive growth, sustainable jobs, and sustainable industrial development. The SDG, on the other hand, is about eradicating poverty, protecting our planet, and ensuring prosperity for all. And so these are both ambitious initiatives that are transformative at their core. So today's panel will try and answer how we can create synergies for learning and networking through the existing AfCFTA and SDG platforms, and also tackling important issues like weak governance to raise additional domestic finance to finance the continent's SDG investment gap. We are very privileged to have two people. The first person is from an organization which name says a lot. So it's the Africa Center for Economic Transformation, ACET. And Caroline Kendi-Robb is a senior advisor at ACET. Caroline, great to have you on this panel. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the Ministry and Minister of Finance. I'm very honored to be part of this panel.
Our pleasure. We also have from the AfCFTA Secretariat, Dr. Tay Kiche. Good afternoon, Tay. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, good afternoon, Bernard. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Brilliant. So let me start with Caroline. What do you do at ACET? And what is ACET, by the way? And what is its connection with this conversation about AfCFTA and the SDGs?
So as you rightly said, it's an organization called the Africa Center for Economic Transformation. And it's a Pan-African think tank. It is, in fact, based in Ghana, but it's looking at Pan-African issues. And it's very focused on economic transformation. Within ACET, there's also a transformational leadership panel, and that is chaired by the former president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And really the focus is on how can countries transform to be looking at issues of trade, looking at issues of poverty, looking at issues of equity. So this issue around the Africa's continental free trade area, as well as the SDGs and how they interact, is really at the soul of ACET.
Brilliant. We'll come back to your thoughts about the AfCFTA itself and its links with SDG. But Dr. Kiche, you are with AfCFTA. Tell us a bit more about what you do at the Secretariat and why it's even important for us to be having a conversation about AfCFTA and SDG at this point.
Yes, good afternoon once again. I'm with the Trade Directorate, Trade and Competition Directorate of the AfCFTA Secretariat, and I'm with the Research Policy Unit of the Trade Directorate. And of course, as you would know, the AfCFTA is one of the flagship projects of the AU Agenda 2063, and therefore part of the broader vision of the AU to achieve the Africa that we want. Both the UN's SDGs and the AU Agenda 2063 represent responses to Africa's developmental deficits, with much, of course, overlap between the two. So, being a flagship project of the Agenda 2063, the AfCFTA and the SDGs, we have, commonalities. So, I guess that is the synergy, the context within which we could have a discussion on the SDGs and the implementation of the after.
Thank you. So, Caroline, what are your reflections on how we can create synergies for learning and networking between the existing AfCFTA and SDG platforms?
Great, thank you. What I think I'm going to do is just give a very quick little bit on context. And I think this is very important because suddenly we find ourselves in a very, very different world, a very rapidly changing world. And with all these multiple interconnected challenges, which include climate change, inequality, technical change, migration, displacement, and even multiple disasters. And then we got the arrival of COVID, and suddenly all these countries and societies, communities were reshaped. And what we see in globally, as well as in Africa, is how we're responding and how different countries are responding. It's changed these political and social systems, and it's creating new social norms, which is fundamental to how we're going to achieve the SDGs. And really now we're faced with these challenges, and they demand collective action. But we know that global leadership and cooperation has been woefully lacking since COVID arrived. So we've got all these multiple kind of challenges. We've got uncertainty and turmoil in global growth. And the pandemic has basically added a massive shock to already fragile global markets and strained many of our trade tensions. So this is, again, a really important point. And I think we don't really have a global order. We somehow have a global disorder. And so we see now this rise of populism, protectionism, nationalism, and these are all enhanced by COVID. And I'm talking very much globally here because it's within this context that we're trying to operate. And we also see citizens' trust in governments across the world has been eroded, and it's created a lot of fragility. So in that context, enter the African continental free trade area. So how are these interconnected within this context? Well, I would argue that the Africa continental free trade area, it is a global game changer. It's a game changer for Africa, but it's a global game changer. And I would also argue that the SDGs, pioneered by Kofi Annan, my ex-boss, by the way, a wonderful man, it is in fact a global framework. So they're both global, they're both bold, they're both ambitious. And as you mentioned earlier, they focus on poverty reduction and, importantly, transformation. So it's all about trying to create the stimulus for Africa's socio-economic recovery from COVID. And you can do that through trade, and you could do that through trying to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And I just want to read a quote by Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who we all know very well, and she's the WTO Director General, because she says very clearly the link between poverty and trade. And I think that's important because that links us into the SDGs. And she says, trade is a force for good, and properly harnessed can help lift millions out of poverty and bring shared prosperity. And I think what we're seeing now is more people focusing on how can trade really bring about poverty reduction and help us achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we need now is really a change in the way in which the world is cooperating. So this Africa continental free trade area comes at a time when much of the world is turning away from cooperation and free trade. And therefore, what I want to really touch upon is just quickly 2 points, which answers directly your question. So that was really the context. And you say, what are the synergies and what are the learnings? Well, I think one of the learnings of the African continental free trade area will be for the world, right? I think it's setting an example for the world, and it's showing what the benefits of cooperation are. Because across the world, countries are questioning trade agreements and economic integration, and alongside turning away from global cooperation, global leadership, and collective action. And we're seeing a drive for short-termism and polarization and isolation. And yet now these multiple threats, they demand long-term thinking and greater cooperation. And this is precisely what the African continental free trade area represents. So while the world turns in one direction, the African Union is moving in another by deepening ties across the continent. So I think this is a breakthrough deal for Pan-African free trade, and the world has a lot to learn from it. But the second point I really want to emphasize is about COVID, because I think the negative impacts of COVID will be cushioned by this pact. And I think that's very, very important. So in the short term, what the Africa Continental Free Trade Area brings is this opportunity for countries to build back better and cushion the effects of the pandemic. But in the longer term, what it does, it will increase the continent's resilience to future shocks. And just one last point, and then I'll hand back, and that's about vaccine manufacturing and about vaccine distribution. And we know that most of the vaccines are in the US, UK, Canada, and Europe. In fact, they have 2 billion surplus vaccine. But we also know that some of the vaccines that are made in Africa are being sent to Europe. So there's some real big crises around how the vaccines are distributed globally and how Africans and African states are getting access. But recently, actually at the beginning of this month, the AU member states, they pulled their purchasing power and they have signed this historic agreement to purchase 220 million doses of Johnson & Johnson's single-shot COVID vaccines, and with the potential to order an additional 180 million doses. Now, I stress this because it has a deep connection to the African Continental Free Trade Area. And I want to make another amazing woman, actually. And this is from Dr. Vera Songwe, who most of us know very well. And she is the executive director of the UNECA. And she says, this is a proud moment for the continent with relation to this purchase of the vaccines. So she said, this is a proud moment for the continent. The vaccines, partly manufactured in South Africa, are a true testament that local production and pooled procurement, as envisioned by the African Continental Free Trade Area, are key to the attainment of a more sustainable post-COVID economic recovery across the continent. So I think there's lots of ways in which these two approaches, the SDGs, achieving them, and this trade area are very, very interconnected. And I'll leave it there. I have other examples, but I think I'll leave it there, and then hopefully we can come back.
Yeah, we can come back to that. Thank you so much. Brilliant context, and also Africa setting an example for the world. That's nice to hear. And then to build back better, and of course, the COVID presenting opportunity to show leadership. Dr. Tekiche, so from the research and trade perspective of AfCFTA, obviously Africa has their problems. Agenda 2063 was very clear. Were you guys thinking about SDGs at all in all of the conversations? Because here we are at Finance Ministry trying to link the two. Are you just trying to solve a trade problem, or do you see a real connection between what AfCFTA is trying to do and what the SDGs are trying to achieve?
Yes, the AU Agenda 2063 was launched when the SDGs were being developed at the global level. Now, this provided an opportunity for Africa's voice to be heard at the global stage. The AU, as you may well know, commissioned NIPAD agency and the AFDB, UNECA, and the United Nations Development Programme Regional Bureau for Africa to develop a common African position on the SDGs. The outcome provided Africa with a unique opportunity to participate in the global debate on how to address the unfinished business of the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, as you recall. It is therefore, normal, usual, that most of the ideas outlined in the Africa position are echoed in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Indeed, the priorities of the Agenda 2063 were fed into the SDGs. This is probably the reason why we have this level of convergence between the AU Agenda 2063 and the Agenda, UN Agenda 2030, for sustainable development. It's been estimated that the convergence is as high as 90%, because of the input of the AU into the Agenda 2030 process. So it is not new, it is not out of the blue, it's something which has been there, and there's a lot of convergence between the two programs, and we are working towards the same. Both programs aim at eradicating poverty, creating jobs, employment for especially Africa, the teeming and youthful population of the continent. So there is a lot of interconnection between the two programs.
Caroline, I followed a bit of the work Asset has done, and I know you are very strong at Asset on growth with depth, DEPTH. You're very interested in diversification because you feel that's one of the ways in which African economies can become more resilient, using examples from Germany and other places. What are your general thoughts about the potential that AfCFTA has as a revenue earner? Because the second aspect of this conversation is about raising domestic resources to finance SDG investment gap. We need money in SDG. So in a sense, the AfCFTA is the cause, the SDG is the effect. It's almost like if we do well on AfCFTA, the SDGs get answered naturally. What are your reflections on what are some of the key things African economies need to do so they can raise additional domestic resources to deal with this SDG investment gap, which is quite large?
No, I think that's a really critical question. I just want to start off by linking to what Dr. Tay had just mentioned, which is about jobs, because I think that's really, really important. And I'm going to go back to health commodities, because I think, if I recall correctly, about 98% of pharmaceuticals are not manufactured on the continent. So I know there is now a big discussion about how do we set up manufacturing of pharmaceuticals and increase that across the continent. And here I've got a nice statistic that says Africa can create over 5 million more jobs if more health commodities are manufactured on the continent. So this is a huge opportunity, and obviously it's a huge gap in the market, and it's something that can fit under the African Continental Free Trade Area, because what that would demand is countries collaborating across, in different ways, so that they can ensure that we have a Pan-African approach to this, and that things can move around, so commodities, people, etc., can move. And this is why this trade area is so important. So I think what I'd like to just throw out here is a couple of answers to what I would say is sustainable finance of the SDGs. So you're right, we can look at all the different ways in which free trade, free movement of people, easier to trade. And I think that will make a huge difference. And there's been quite a lot of work done on it. I want to throw in something else which has a direct impact on domestic resource mobilization. And this is looking at something called global trade integrity, mixed with a bit of tax and transparency. And I think one of the key things, again, I've got trying to connect the global with the Africa, and it's really about stemming illicit financial flows to increase these domestic resource mobilizations. And it's something that many people in Africa have been really trying to, and Becky did some great work on this about illicit financial flows, because Africa was losing billions. In fact, they were losing more in illicit financial flows than they were getting back in terms of aid. And recently the G7 and G20 are moving on this, and they've approved what was called an inclusive framework. And that's to try and understand better what money comes in and what money is going out and where the money is going, and understanding who the owners are of many of these organizations, where a lot of the money goes missing out of a lot of different countries because we don't know who the owners are of these different companies, quite frankly. So I think what the Africa Continental Trade Area offers is an opportunity to promote good governance both globally and across Africa. And that's looking at issues of international trade transactions that are legitimate, transparent, and properly priced as a way to ensure legitimacy in global trading systems. So I'll give you an example. Misinvoiced trade transactions, that's basically trade fraud, and illegally procured or produced goods. It could be illegal mining or fishing. And often a lack of clarity in a lot of the free trade zones as well. And these revenues, like you mentioned, they are needed now more than ever before to assist with the pandemic response. And if we get that right, then we will be on the pathway to better respond to achieving the SDGs. So it's all about being much clearer on who's involved in trade transactions, what goods are being traded as well, and we need to reduce this transnational crime. A lot of it, as we know, is global in nature, and we've got to get the global right. We've got to share information, and this is what the G7 and G20 are working on. In my opinion, not fast enough, but at least we are making progress, and it's a lot more transparent than it used to be, so that's good. The second point I want to mention around how are we funding, how are we financing in a sustainable way some of the key aspects of the SDGs and the free trade area is about financial inclusion of women. And I think there's a lot of ways in which this can be done. And we know that women are the most excluded from access to finance. And we also know that in many African countries, and it's super exciting, there's a lot of new digital ways in which women can get access to finance, which they've never done before. So this is critical. We know women account for 70% of informal cross-border traders in Africa. And, with access to finance, they can transform many of the very, very small scale enterprises into something more significant. And we also know that small and medium-sized enterprises across Africa account for 90% of jobs. So I think there's something there as well that would need to be tracked. It's something that Africa does well so far in many countries. They're pioneers, but we need to do that more. And we need to think also, and it's very interesting, people are talking about a Pan-African way in which you can move money across different state boundaries. And that is really interesting. It's complicated, but it's really interesting. But any ways in which we can try and ensure that women have better sustainable financing, I think that will be transformational, as we know, for families, for health, for education, and will definitely contribute greatly to the SDGs.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for those thoughts. I think we should jump on what Caroline said about dealing with illicit financial flows, trade misinvoicing, and trade fraud, and just talk about what the AfCFTA Secretariat is doing to deal with these things. Because I was at a forum this week where people were saying, look, some people are skeptical that AfCFTA will just become an opportunity for people to bring in imports from other parts of the world and just flood our market. So there are lots of concerns. What are some of the steps being taken to deal with this so that the revenue benefits of the free trade area are actually derived? Jay?
Yes, you are right. A major source of concern, in terms of mobilization of resources, revenue, to finance the SDGs, is this whole question of illicit financial flows. These flows compromise resource mobilization efforts across the continent. Currently, as you may know, Africa loses more than 83 billion per year in trade, misinvoicing alone. So these are huge outflow of resources. So it is important, that of course these are what has been estimated, but we know that it is very difficult to arrive at the entire costs, of these illicit outflows from the continent, because of the very nature of this activity. They are illicit, so it's difficult to know. So the way out, one of the pathways, to get around this is enhanced trade. So trade is one of the pillars, one of the pathways, for Africa to get around these challenges, these difficulties. Trade has played a critical role in economic development of countries, both developed and developing. We can recall that the rise of the Asian tigers in China was largely attributed to the impact of trade. This had a tremendous impact on incomes, jobs, and poverty reduction. In fact, through trade, China was able to lift over 300 million of its population out of poverty in just a few decades. So that, I think, is the way to go. And that is, where the AfCFTA, becomes pertinent, becomes very relevant. Currently, countries, of the continent survive mainly, on exports of very few narrow range of primary commodities, to traditional markets in North America, Europe, Asia, etc. And as it is well known, Africa's over-reliance on the exports of primary, commodities is detrimental to our achievements of economic development. Exports of raw materials generally attract very low prices, and then with insufficient foreign exchange revenues, whilst downstream, along the traditional export value chains, we find, countries making huge wealth, resources. For example, if we take Ghana, Ghana supplies about a fifth of all cocoa beans in the world, for which we earn about $2 billion. Now, this is less than a fifth of the value of chocolate that is manufactured, branded, and sold. So it means that there is really need to upgrade, to move beyond primary exports of raw materials into processed products, where really we have the wealth, where the wealth is created, where profits are made. There is therefore the need to take action to dismantle this kind of colonial economic model by transforming the structure of our economies from primary commodity export based to one of manufacturing, industrial export driven economies. As a result of this colonial system type of trading, we don't trade much with ourselves. If you look at Europe, intra-European trade is about close to 70%. In Asia is over 50%. And in Africa, we're looking at around 17%. Just an example, you take countries like Egypt and South Africa. They supply final products, chocolate products, for their domestic markets, and of course, sub-regional markets. But predominantly, they source their immediate inputs from outside the continent. Meanwhile, Africa is the largest producer of cocoa, the major input in the production of chocolates. Now, another example, cotton. About 70% of cotton exports from Africa are in raw form, embodying limited value additions. Only 12%, take the form of yarn, 18% cotton fabrics, etc. So, and this trade cuts across almost all major commodities most African countries export. they are exported in raw form with little or no value addition, while the value-added versions are imported by expanding scarce foreign exchanges. When you have this kind of economy, your young people cannot find jobs. And then when they cannot find jobs, you see them trying to get to Europe and drowning in the Mediterranean. Now, so that is where AfTA comes in. AfTA is very critical. It is designed to create a tariff-free, quota-free continent that can boost intra-African trade and investment, grow local businesses, and stimulate industrialization, create jobs for the continent's teeming and youthful population. I don't know, you are aware it's been estimated that of the population of Africa, 1.3 billion, as we speak, by 2015, is likely to hit 2.5 billion. And between now and 2050, we are expecting, it's estimated, that there will be an additional 900 million added to the labor force. Now, how do we integrate? How do we create jobs for this teeming population? That is where the AfTA it's very comes in timely, very critical, important. We need to industrialize, to create jobs, to absorb this teeming, youthful, intelligent, smart population that we have on the continent. Now, this requires this industrialization, agenda requires a market considerably larger than what we find with most of our countries individually. The limited individual country market size makes it imperative to explore, exporting to regional, continental, and even global markets. The AfTA then presents a renewed opportunity for Africa to steer its economic relations away from this primary producing dependency, to self-reliant value addition industrial activities, as well as higher levels of intra-African trade. Importantly, the AfTA, by removing the barriers to trade, is expected to not just grow trade, but to grow the trade that we need. That is very important. Not trade satisfying the needs of, the North African or Asian or non-African partners, but the kind of trade that, that we need. And the AfTA changes the value proposition for investors, by providing larger markets, because coming together with all the 55 countries, that is, if all the countries, now we are at 54, but assuming even with 54.
So Doc, not to cut you, you are very clear in your mind that AfTA is the path that Africa needs. We have to wrap up. I just wanted a closing comment from Caroline whilst we just wrap this up, because we have about half an hour for questions, and I'm hoping that some of the other panelists who were scheduled to be here would then join the live session to give us some more insight. So Caroline, if you have some quick comments in a minute to just, I sense optimism on your side. Can you just confirm that whilst we wrap this?
Yeah, definitely optimism on my side. I just want to make a quick comment, and I want to follow up one point that Dr. Tay mentioned. And, there was this really recent article by Brown and Boateng, who both work at the Africa Centre for Economic Transformation. They've done a lot of work on trade and economic transformation. And what they basically say is that the pact, the trade area, will accelerate economic transformation and help Africa, and I quote, escape the colonial legacy. And that's really, really important, because most of the trade, like you're saying, is set up for somebody else's needs. And that's why it's so hard and has been hard to get to where we are now. And that's why if the Africa Continental Trade Area is seen as a transformational tool, I think we will absolutely see something very positive. But I just want to mention another point that they both raise. And they say, absolutely right, and I quote them, the devil is in the implementation. And that's the Secretariat, so that's you, Dr. Tay, all that implementation. But it's so important, it can be done. I'm very confident, we have to be confident, but it is very exciting that this collaboration is happening now, when a lot of global collaboration is going in the wrong direction. And that is why I'm excited, because we need this. The way the world works, the way everybody is working, the challenges that we have, we all need to cooperate and collaborate better. And this is a shining example. So I am positive. I think you're on mute, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Caroline Kendi-Rob, Senior Advisor, Africa Center for Economic Transformation. It's based in Ghana, but he's joining us from the global village somewhere in Europe. Thank you so much for insights. Thank you, Dr. Tay Kiche, for sharing those wonderful insights as well from the perspective of AfCFTA and what it can do. We still have half an hour for questions, and hopefully some of the original panelists will join as we wrap up session 4 of day 1 of the 2021 virtual SDG Investment Fair. So Dr. Tikicha, thank you, Caroline, thank you very much. We'll revert to the panel or the questions to see if we can receive any more. Thank you very much.